pozdravljeni na okrogli mizi, kako usklajevati zasebno in poklicno življenje. Ta okrogla miza je organizirana v okviru DES, se pravi Dnevov enakosti spolov, ki jih koordinira profesorica dr. Milica Antič-Gaber, za kar se ji v imenu cele fakultete res lepo zahvaljujem. Najprej lepo pozdravljam profesorja dr. Floriana Bieberja in se mu zahvaljujem, da si je vzel čas in prišel iz Gradca k nam. Profesor je politolog, zgodovinar, specialist za balkanska vprašanja in še marsikaj drugega, kaj več bo o sebi povedal sam in pa seveda tudi naša moderatorka, profesorica dr. Janja Polajnar-Lenarčič, za kar se ji tudi zahvaljujem, da je prevzela to ne preveč lahko nalogo, se pravi koordiniranje okrogle mize. Predno predam besedo, bi se rada zahvalila tudi prorektorici, profesorici dr. Kseniji Vidmar-Horvat. Veliko nam pomeni, da je tudi predstavnica rektorata z nami, ker si vsaj na Filozofski fakulteti želimo, da bi neke vrste služba, ki bi nudila pomoč svojim zaposlenim pri usklajevanju zasebnega in poklicnega življenja in pa seveda nudila pomoč tudi pri drugih stiskah svojih zaposlenih, ugledala luč sveta čim prej. Tako da hvala, da ste si vzeli čas. Lepo pozdravljena seveda tudi naša dekanja, profesorica dr. Mojca Šlamberger-Brezar, ki je brez pretiravanja vedno v prvi bojni vrsti, kadar gre za zagotavljanje pogojev, ki olajšujejo usklajevanje zasebnega in poklicnega življenja. Seveda lepo pozdravljeni tudi vsi ostali. Jaz upam, da nam bo ostalo na koncu tudi nekaj časa, da boste lahko tudi ostali postavili vprašanje profesorju. Zdaj še to, danes bi morali biti z nami še dve predstavnici iz Gradca, Julija Špigel in pa Senka Bajgora, se pravi predstavnici službe Unikit, vendar sta žal tik pred zdajci odpovedali svoje sodelovanje. Razlog pa je usklajevanje poklicnega in zasebnega življenja. Tako da moramo biti pač razumevajoči. Tako, zdaj pa kar predajam besedo. Prosim.
Yes, good morning everyone. Good morning, esteemed Professor Florian Bieber, Dean Professor Mojca Šlamberger-Brezar, Vice Chancellor Professor Ksenija Vidmar, Associate Deans Professor Mojca Smolej and Professor Irena Samide. I would also like to warmly greet Professor Milica Antič-Gaber, who is the motor behind the Gender Equality Implementation Plan also at the Faculty of Arts and is the Sociology Professor. Dear colleagues and students, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today for this important panel discussion on gender equality issues, in particular on the topic of how the university and the faculty can support their staff members and students to balance work and family responsibilities. We will explore different centers at the University of Graz, their fields of work and subject areas as well as good practices. But let me first introduce Professor Bieber, who is a member of the Working Group for Equal Opportunities, which works to promote gender equality throughout the university and provides a forum for discussing gender-related issues and challenges. But first of all, he's also a director of the Center for Southeastern European Studies at the University of Graz. He holds a Jean Monnet Chair in the Europeanization of Southeastern Europe. He's the coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, BIPAC, has worked for the European Centre for Minority Issues and taught at Kent University, United Kingdom, and was also visiting professor, for example, at the Nationalism Studies Programme at CEU. Perhaps three recent publications from Professor Bieber are include Negotiating Unity and Diversity in the European Union, published by Palgrave in 2021, and then Debating Nationalism, published by Bloomsbury in 2020, and The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans, also published by Palgrave in 2020. The University of Graz is a little bit smaller than our university. It has around 32,000 students. Our university has 37,000 students, around 4,300 staff members, if I'm informed correctly, and can be set as a good example as it has a strong commitment to promoting gender equality and fostering a culture of diversity and inclusion. In the past 20 years, the university has implemented several initiatives aimed at addressing gender issues and promoting equal opportunities for all members of its community. For example, the university has established a coordination center for gender studies and equal opportunities, which conducts research on gender issues and also offers courses on gender and diversity. And the center also provides support and resources for students and staff who are dealing with gender-related challenges and issues. And secondly, the university started a UniKid project that we are focusing on today already in 2004, so it's almost 20 years when everything started at the University of Graz. And the project was first aimed at helping staff and students to combine work and studying with their private life. And then in 2010, the center furthered its activities to provide support also for carers. Thus the name UniKid and UniCare. So Professor Bieber, would you be so kind and present us a few or the most important fields of work and subject areas of this center? It is called officially the Center, the University Work Family Balance Information Center.
Thanks. Well, thanks first of all for having me here, and it's a great pleasure to be in Ljubljana as always. Usually I speak about my research, and for once I don't speak about my research, which is
in the end you will.
Okay, good. But anyhow, so it's a pleasure to be here, and regret I have to make apologies for my colleagues who couldn't make it, but it's a very busy agenda, and actually one of them has to accept, the reward for the university for their work in providing these services of UniKid and UniCare. And I think the key point is really, twofold, as you already mentioned, and it's been around for now, the start nearly 20 years ago, in full really for the last 13 years, and it's two pillars. One is providing some specific tailored services for children, some of which are children of staff or students, and otherwise also more broad activities, kind of reaching out to not students, but to children. There's from supporting initiatives such as daycare for children, to there are affiliated kindergartens and primary schools, which are not run by the university, but which are closely interlinked, which offer spaces for faculty and students as a priority. And then the second pillar, which I think has even grown and become more important, is trying to really provide advice for faculty and students of how to balance family life with university life. And this is one thing which I think is really essential, and it links, it shows how everything is interlinked. The work, I'm here as a member of the Equal Opportunities Committee, but you cannot talk about equal opportunities if you don't talk about issues such as work-family balance. So issues such as how can you have a family and at the same time be a faculty member or a student? Because if you are, if classes are not scheduled, or if any other obligations are such that you cannot really have a family, then it really also often risks reproducing gender roles. It risks pushing certain people out of that. So in a certain way, you have to have both sides. If you want to have equality in a university, you also have to make sure that there is a work-life balance. And this is, it's an uphill struggle. And I think this is something which the UniCare is aware of, because, the nature of academic work is not a 9-to-5 classically organized work, as we all know who are in academia. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we combine the schedules, which are often not the regular hours of other jobs, with actually the need to have also an ability to have a family, and no matter whether we're, how we identify in the family, whether we're the father or the mother. So this is in a certain way trying to, so basically what happens is, on one side, it's providing advice. There are workshops on how to deal with these issues, so providing for staff and students of how to manage this in a certain way. Trying to raise awareness inside the university to kind of make sure that decision makers don't ignore this. That you don't say, everybody has time, let's schedule a meeting at 7 o'clock in the evening. Because then people might say, well, wait, I have children who need to eat, who need to be taken care of, who I can't leave alone. These things naturally then, disadvantage families or disadvantage caretakers and families. Mm-hmm. So it's about raising awareness within the institution, which is very important. And, it's never ending because, we all have seen this in universities where people say, well, let's organize the lecture, let's organize this event, at times where people have to take care of family members. And of course, it's not just children. We're also talking about, for example, elderly. It might be parents you might need to take care of, not just your own children. So this is also what we're talking about. Then one thing is also providing advice and encouraging. It's about also a change of kind of attitudes, and it's changing in the broader society. One of the issues is that, for example, you have not just a maternity leave, but you have paternity leave, right? So fathers can also take off time. So this is something which was, very rare 10 years ago, and now it's become more normal. So it's about kind of also advising fathers to say, well, why don't you take off some time? And I see this. You see the real difference. I have a colleague where both parents are working at the university. He's a research manager and she's a researcher. And they decided to say the first year after the birth of their child, she takes off, and the second year he takes off. And this is supported, so he gets the full package. And it really makes a big difference because she's able to restart her career, after a year break, rather than, him working and she not working for 2 years and then maybe struggling more to get back in. So it's these things where the Unicare provide consultations, kind of try to change the climate. Both in terms of the staff and the students, to advise them of how to make use of these offers, give them legal advice, tell them about the advantages, but also try to change institutions about how they think about that. And that's not just kind of changing the rector or the deans, but it's every decision maker. I'm a director of a center, so of course I have to also think about that. I have to think about, in my work, how do I engage with my colleagues to encourage them to manage this balance? And so, it's also about, it's simple things, encouraging, for example, when you organize an academic conference. Do you, for example, organize daycare? And this is something we've started doing, is that if we have an academic conference, that we offer, if it's a big event, we're saying, okay, there is a daycare facility at the university where visiting scholars can put their children, and it's organized and structured, and we cover the costs for that, for example. Not every conference does that, but it can be done. We've done it in a large conference a few years ago to say, well, if a researcher who has a young child has to, we can't have care at the same time, can bring them there while they're giving their paper. So it doesn't exclude young mothers, for example, or young fathers for that matter, from attending academic events. So it's about kind of this working in different directions to try to really change minds about how you can have a family and also be an academic. Because you too often, I was at an event a few years ago in Graz about for postdocs, and they were saying, if you think you can have a normal family life and be an academic, forget about it. You better, I was, kind of like rather shocked. This was a senior, I should say, female researcher who said that, and I was, I was quite shocked, and I was, kind of, maybe she was describing her own experience, and this is not to say that indeed it has been very difficult, so it's not to deny that it's difficult, but it's about not accepting that and not kind of saying, well, if you want to make a choice to become an academic, you have to give up on that, but rather saying, well, how can we change the structures to actually make this normal? That that this is not an either-or choice or sold as such, because that's really counterproductive. So this is, I think, the overall approach, and then working in many different directions and in ways within the institution to make this possible.
Yes, you mentioned, or I would like to focus first on the Unicate part. You mentioned that we have that you are also organizing, or you're working together with affiliated kindergartens, for example. But you also, if I'm informed correctly, organize care for school children during summer break. Which is also very important, because in primary school this is a long break of 2 months, for example, in Slovenia, more than 2 months, and sometimes it's really difficult. How do I care for a child which still needs to be looked after and do whatever it takes at work as well? So that's this. If you could shed some light on. And I also read that you promote science to kids. For example, the concept is known as Kinderuni, as a university for children, which is actually focusing on primary school kids. But you now try to already promote science in this very early age at kindergarten. So perhaps these 2 points.
Sure. First of all, yes, the university is part of in a certain way, larger network from both the city as well as other institutions which provide these kind of activities over the summer for children to kind of learn, but also be taken care of while parents often have to work. And again, it reaches out beyond the university in the idea that, of course, parents have to work, and children need activities that can't just be left alone. So that's part of that. And of course, the university is just part of a larger network to offer these activities. There are others in regards, from sports to teaching, other things, and this university contributes with its knowledge base to that. So that's the one side, as you mentioned, and it's certainly part of the understanding of being aware that parents are not able to take 2 months off. I mean, even we as academics might not be teaching in the summer, but it doesn't mean that we have 2 months holiday, right? Which I always tell my students who say, happy holidays, see you in September, and they say, well, it's not quite like that. But it's also, again, as you mentioned, the Children's University, and there are lots of activities to kind of bring younger children into the kind of share knowledge with them. We have which kind of deals with philosophical topics, with these kind of issues to just kind of raise their curiosity. We also have many activities sometimes with local schools. I mean, I've gone to primary schools as well as to gymnasiums to talk to children. And there are other programs. The university does it. Also, the Austrian Foreign Exchange Office does that. They have called ambassadors, where academics can sign up, and then teachers at schools can book them, can invite them to teach a class or so on. And I've done this several times, both through that system and independently. And partly the logic is to first of all of course, tell children about university, but I think there's a deeper point to this. I mean, one of them is to make universities accessible to children who don't naturally know about universities, because we know Austria has a very bad rate of reproduction of social class in academic education. So it's children of parents who've been to university who go to university, and we see this reproduced. It's got a lot to do with the way the school system works in Austria. But it's also obvious that if children know from their parents about university, I mean, my son visits me in my office, so of course he knows what a university is. He's seen it from the inside. For him, it's nothing alien. But for a child whose parents don't have not been to university, not to mention professor, but just not a student, they don't know it. And so this is a way to kind of also reduce the fear or the strangeness of university for children who might have never who don't know what's going on, and we tell them, we're human beings as well, and try to show them the benefits of what interesting things you can do. And so in a certain way, it's both about the content of these programs to kind of get children's critical thinking, to kind of encourage them to take them serious as individuals, but it's also about kind of trying to get them to think about themselves and universities, especially when they might have not thought about it otherwise.
Thank you. And an interesting concept is also the so-called children's rooms, or are the so-called children's rooms or children parents' rooms, Kinderzimmer, Kinderelternzimmer auf Deutsch, completely unknown to us. So I would be interested, what's the idea behind it, where you installed that? Is it meant primarily for staff members or students as well? And is it really used, or is it just an empty room there?
Well, I think it's. We have one, for example, in the university library, and it's a room where children can, you would sometimes call it a playroom. And if you go to any supermarket today, they have that, right? If you go to IKEA or to a shopping center, they have that. And it's used, right? So why not have it at a university? Because exactly for that purpose, that you have situations where, for example, students have to write a test and they have a young child. And what do you do in the meantime? So maybe you bring your relative or a friend. So it has to be under adult supervision, but a kid can spend time there. So I don't know the numbers of usage, but the logic is to say, well, if people send their kids to rooms, at shopping centers, a university is a place where people also spend time, and it's just lowering the barrier for people who have children to make it easier to say, okay, I need to go to the library, or I think it's more for, of course, people whose children are not yet in fully organized care situations like kindergartens or so. But very young children, or sometimes out of the hours of kindergartens, where then you can basically have a space where the children can be. I mean, again, it sounds like it's a small thing, it's a room, but it's just these little things which just make it a lot easier for for people in a certain position to use the university in a way. I mean, I've had situations where I had a young mother having to write an exam with her baby, because she, but then, how do you deal with that? And so it's just kind of creating these spaces where people can combine having a family and being either a student, or in that case it's mostly for students rather than for staff. But again, where you can have a place where you can get a book from the library, read the book, and your child can be in the room, and nobody's going to look at you, kind of like, oh, what is the child disturbing me? So it's also creating this in a certain way environment where you can do your work and at the same time have your child there, and not the traditional library where every whisper is met with a psh, then of course having a small child might be something where you wouldn't take him or her to the library, but like this now all of a sudden you can do it, and that's the logic.
Thank you. You mentioned that the care part has grown in importance in this center, this information center. Could you perhaps tell us if the UniCare activities are now more prominent than the UniKid activities? So if help to those who take care of a sick member or an elderly person are getting more and more demand?
Well, I think it's getting to be more important for also the reason that the university has become more international. 15, 20 years ago, most of the staff at the university would have been, and also the students would have been from Graz and Styria. And this has changed. So our university has become a lot more international in terms of our student body. We have a lot of students who are international students, whether it's through Erasmus or through other programs, or who are moving to Graz permanently to study there, but also staff. So, today I would say most new professors are not from Graz and not from Austria. And so you have a lot more people who move to Graz also on the level of postdocs or visiting fellows, visiting researchers. So there are a lot more people who are coming in and who don't know, for example, how the legal system works, how the care system works. So the situation is very common that a new professor comes in and they have children and they need to figure out, how do I find a kindergarten spot? What kind of legal protection do I have? So this kind of advice where you go and you get kind of guidance is become a lot more important as a result of the kind of internationalization and greater mobility. So this is, I think, has driven up the demand. I mean, of course, if you're from Graz and you grow up and you have a family, then of course you know what kindergartens, you know how it works. But if you come, I have a colleague who's joining the university, who's coming with her daughter, who's 10 years old. So she comes from Germany. She doesn't know which schools there are. How does it work? By when do you have to register for schools? What are the requirements? And so then you have a place you can go to and can say, okay, I have a 10-year-old, what are the options? How do I pick a school? Where are schools? What should I pay attention to? So it's kind of like an advice, an office for giving advice, which has, I think, become very important. We also have others, we have a welcome center which gives advice for students and incoming researchers, especially helping with residence permit and these kind of things. But this is, of course, for those who have, or have elderly, family members also sometimes moving with them. So it's especially, I think, important for those people who are not anchored in local society, who have other places to ask these questions. And so in a certain way, I think I was saying earlier how all of these things are linked. So if you want to make a university more international, if you want to make a university more open to people to come from different knowledges or lack of knowledge about the local context, then you need to offer those things. So if you want to have, if a English-speaking, postdoc from the Netherlands wants to come to Graz, who has a young son or young daughter, they're not going to be encouraged if they come to university and they say, okay, here's your job contract, please, come back in 3 months and that's it. But if the university says, okay, welcome, and this is where you go for getting advice on this, because you have a daughter or a son, this is where you can get advice for kindergarten, this is how you get your residence permit, this is how you find apartments, then, you get better researchers and more international researchers, because they're going to say, I feel welcome here, rather than, the university, will hire me, but will give you nothing. And so it's part of that change. And, it's still a long way to go. These are all small offices, but it is changing, and it's in a certain way mutually reinforcing. You get to be more international if you have these services, but these services are also really important once you are more international.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. You mentioned workshops, that you organize workshops that people can share their experience, but also get information on what facilities you have or what solutions you offer. Do you have any other activities to promote these centers? For example, classical activities such as posters and leaflets, etc., or do you organize meetings or even any other stuff? How to promote these activities?
Yeah, I think they're besides. The workshops are really kind of sharing experience, advice. Then it's also integrated into. So, for example, new staff members there's some kind of a program for new staff members, which teaches them about all kinds of elements from equal opportunities and kind of gender bias to teach. Especially if they are, let's say, research staff or teaching staff, they get taught also about teaching methodologies, about legal obligations. And then they also get informed about this. So it's in a certain way integrated into the way in which new staff members are often are often trained, and then of course the information is shared with people who are in some kind of position of responsibility, and then also their consultation. So you can always go there and get a consultation if you. But of course, the key thing is finding out about it. And that's I think, as far as I know, and it's becoming better known, so that people really turn to the office to get information.
So word of mouth as well.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. A recommendation for us, you mentioned before that you can start with small things like installing a room at the university or beside a library, but would you have a recommendation for us? So what would be the activities that would prove most effective, for example, in this balancing of work and family responsibilities?
I mean, I talked to my colleagues at Unicare yesterday and said, what are the 3 things you would want me to suggest which another university would have? And they said, have one person at least who's designated to do this and nothing else. They said, it's not good to make the person responsible for non-discrimination, for gender equality, for childcare, for all of that. It's like, have one person who's just in charge of work life for children, this aspect, because it's different from discrimination, it's different from gender equality. They're linked, but they are separate. So make one person responsible, give them a budget, doesn't have to be big, but give them a designated budget, and give them the authority to take initiatives. So not make them subordinated, that they have to ask a rector or a dean for everything, but give them the ability to freely develop plans. So these were the 3 points of advice they said. And because of course every university, every local environment will have different needs and different awareness. So I don't think that the level of awareness is the same. There are different backgrounds in each environment. I mean, so I think there isn't a one size fits all. I mean, I think certainly the first thing I would say is raise awareness. I mean, this is the thing. Like, I didn't think about so many of those things myself. When somebody says, hey, why don't you organize a kindergarten or daycare for children during a conference? It never occurred to me until somebody told me that you can do this, or that there is actually a benefit. And so I think it's a lot of these things, it's not that they're not there because people are hostile to them, but they're not aware of it. So you have to kind of talk to people who are regular, quote unquote, academics who are taking decisions about these things, about when they schedule exams, how they organize conferences, and all of those things, which then impact many others. So I think it's about kind of then really convincing them, and then making these small steps, like the room or things like that. I mean, again, I don't know. One has to then listen to people also, maybe talk to those affected and see, what do you need? What would make a difference for you? Because it's not that there's the situations might be too different of what is the priority. But I think it's trying to raise awareness among those who take decisions. What are the potential issues, and what can you do in these small things to make a difference? And then talking to those affected and saying, okay, so what is it? Is it like, is it that you need for example, so it's a non-profit which we have on campus, which offers daycare by hours. So basically, you can have like a whole day, but you can also have 2-3 hours. This is like a service which is offered for staff and students. So that's like where you need to take an exam, you need to have an appointment or whatever, and you can have your child taken care of for a couple of hours. So they don't have to be at kindergarten, but they can be visiting. And so having these kind of things, so like thinking about these services which are not even run by the university, but which are linked with the university, so kind of but making them available. So it's this counseling and changing awareness, which I think make the biggest difference.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, you are a member of the working group for equal opportunities, so I would now like to turn to this group. And the idea behind this group is to promote gender equality throughout the university and provides a forum for discussing gender-related issues. So could you perhaps shed light on how the group is composed, what are its responsibilities, rights? Before you mentioned some things, for example, when a new staff, when new staff is appointed, etc. So.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so yes, I mean, I should mention the Equal Opportunities group was originally founded to deal with and ensure gender equality and address imbalances in the university system. But now it's also broader. It deals with other forms of discrimination, be they ethnicity, be they ageism, be they racism. So, of course, all kinds of other forms of discrimination have become quite prominent because, of course, they're equally serious issues at the university. And it's been around now since 1990, so it's been around for several decades. And the mandate has grown over time as well as its work. Now, basically, the way to imagine it is that there is an administrative office which manages it, but most of the members are, faculty members, student members, assistants, like myself. So, my job my job at the university is to be a professor of history and politics, and I'm joining it together with colleagues from, natural sciences, from law, so basically for each faculty there's at least 2 members who are regular professors at the faculty who are in the committee. And as well as professors, in Austria we have something called Mittelbau, which means basically everybody who is a researcher who is not a professor, so it means assistants usually, or postdocs, or we have senior lecturers and senior researchers, and then students. So all of them are represented in there, and we try to make sure that all of the levels are represented as well as all of the faculties. So that's the composition. So the people who are doing most of the work are people who are doing it not as their main job, but as an additional activity, which of course is all of us an additional burden, but I think it's also a benefit because, first of all, the benefit is that we all learn by being part of it. I didn't work on gender issues in my academic research. It's something which of course affects my research, but it's not my main focus. And then also, I don't know if when my colleagues suggested that I would come here today, I was thinking, because of course we have many women who are members, but we also have men who are members, and it's also like a deliberate. I think it's very good because it's also about signaling very clearly that it's not, that while gender equality, there's an assumption about it that, of course it's women who are mostly affected. But if the bodies are only composed of women, then men often don't realize the issues. And so I've learned a lot from being in it, from the issues which one deals with at the university. So I think by being a member, one also gets to be more aware and self-reflective. So I think it's very good in a certain way that all of us are there as people who are involved in regular academic research and who are doing this in addition. So in a certain way we are ourselves in a certain way trying to improve our own awareness of these issues, as well as talking to peers about it. So it's not kind of seen, this is these are the people who deal with gender. So it's often compartmentalized mentally, but rather saying no, this is a mainstream issue. It's something where colleagues who are doing whatever else research are also dealing with. And I think it's this kind of mainstreaming which is very important. So what do we do? And this is so we are like the place to contact if you feel any form of discrimination at the university. So we are like basically taking, complaints. So if anybody feels, a student or a staff member feels disadvantaged, then this is our office which takes care of it. Mostly this is then the office which deals with it, with these kind of complaints. So us as academic kind of faculty members, we deal with the processes. And I think these are just as important, if not more important, is making sure that the processes in the university are not exclusionary. Mm-hmm. So what it means is that in all of the main processes, they're members of the Equal Opportunities Committee. So basically, if there are new job hirings, first of all, the job advertisement has to be reviewed by our office. So we have to take a look and see, is there anything in there which is exclusionary. And it's not about, just gender, but it's about if the job is very, very narrowly defined for an open call, we often, we raise the alarm bell because we say, that seems like it's not an open job. It's meant for just hiring one person, and it's an excuse of an open process. So this has got nothing to do with gender equality, but of course it's a result because you basically say this is a job for one person, and we don't want to have an open call. And we all know this happens at universities. And so we're trying to then say, well, you have to have an open, if you want to have if it's an open process, it has to be transparent, which means it has to be formulated in a way that there's more than one person in the world which can apply for it. I'm exaggerating, but I think you all know what I mean. And so it's first reviewing the advertisements. In any hiring committee, because especially if it's a professorship, there has to be a hiring committee. And there has to be a member of our group to join it. So we don't have voting rights. So the hiring is done by the people who are appointed as university or external members who are associated with the field. But we are obliged to be part of the process. So we are part of the meetings of the committee, and we have the same access to all of the materials, the evaluations, and so on. And the point is, of course, on one side, to make sure there's no open discrimination. And we often, and it's not, nobody's going to say, oh, she's a woman, she can't have the job. This is not what happens. The issue is more the invisible biases, or the biases which people have, not even consciously of their own right. So, if you compare two candidates, and, one candidate is a woman who had, 3 children and has taken 3 years or 4 years out or 6 years out of her academic career because of the children, and you have a male candidate who is the same age and who hasn't done that, you have to be careful when you compare their biographies. Can you expect the woman has had the same amount of academic achievements as the man? Because age is not a good measure. You have to look at it in terms of professional, in a certain way, age, rather than physical age. Sometimes an evaluator might write and say, oh, he has achieved more than she has over, in his life, although they're the same age. And then you have to kind of read and say, wait a minute, but, there's a reason why. And so it's these things, and this is already a more clear example, but it's kind of helping the committee to read these things and just draw attention to them. It's also, so that's one thing which we do. So we also then, if you for example then decide who to hire, you have to justify it. And so even for jobs which are not professorships, but let's say assistants or so, there we have to be invited if there are interviews. If there are any job interviews, we have to be invited. We often don't have the capacity to go because it's a big university. There are so many interviews. But we have to be at least invited because it means that that at least there isn't open sexism or open kind of favoritism happening in those interviews. We can't check all of it, but at least that we're able to be present. And if selection is done without that being invited, we can theoretically demand for a repetition of the process. If any job hiring has to be justified. So if you're hiring an assistant, if you're assigning a professor, you have to justify why the candidate is better than the other applicants, right? So of course, we know this. If you have 300 applicants for a job, you can't write a biography of everybody, but you have to say why this person is better qualified based on the advertisement. So you have to say it has to be always based on the advertisement. And I've done both. I've been both on the side of the equal opportunities body as well as the person writing it. Sometimes it's a very tedious task, but it forces you to make sure that you're really that the criteria you're asking for are the one you're measuring the person against, and not something else. And it really forces you to say, okay, am I really picking this person because of the criteria I set out? And it's just trying to make sure there's fairness. And again, most of this fairness does not even affect. It's not about even gender or even ethnicity, but it's just kind of making the process more transparent and more fair, because our logic is if it's more transparent and more fair, it's those who are more disadvantaged who are going to benefit. But in a certain way, everybody benefits because it's a more transparent process. So these are just examples. Other examples is curricular commissions. So I don't know how it works in Slovenia, but we have curricular commissions who are in charge of the academic curricula of all disciplines, and it's a body which is composed out of elected usually or by respective institutes, faculties, and in those we're also represented. So we are again there as an observer. We don't vote, but we are able to to give advice. And again, it's about just kind of making sure that the process is fair and transparent. So it's on these levels. Also the other element is evaluation. So for example, all university units get evaluated at regular intervals. So every depends on the number of years. I think it's 5-6 years. It depends a little bit from a center to an institute to a faculty. Any kind of institutional unit gets evaluated. And in the evaluation process, we are present. So usually the evaluators are external experts in the field, and they are experts of that discipline. And they evaluate, how is the academic output, how is that? And we are there then to ask, are there issues of discrimination? How is the gender balance in the leadership or in the staff? And again, it's not about, we don't say, okay, 55% men, 45% women, bad. It's about having a conversation and finding out, because it might not be a problem. It's not about, but it's about just asking the question, saying, what are you doing to help to promote female researchers? What are you doing about, how do you deal with issues of discrimination? Just kind of asking those questions. And then in the report, there's always a section in every evaluation where we're reporting our impressions. It's usually it's not at all, I think, from the outset, sometimes people say, oh, it's like kind of, we're asking difficult questions. It's actually not at all, a hostile process. Of course, there's sometimes tensions and sometimes difficulties, but most of the time it's about just raising awareness. Again, it comes back to what we talked earlier, just kind of getting people in people of positions of responsibility to think about those things. And so I think one of the benefit of the office is that we are not just the place to go if there's a problem, but we're trying to be there at every kind of level of institutions in the processes to make sure that these processes are transparent and that somebody who's an outsider can kind of, like we are, is part of it. But then, for example, if it's a hiring we're outsiders, insiders, because I'm usually not overseeing hiring processes in the natural sciences, right? So there my colleague from the natural sciences would be. I'm in the Faculty of Humanities, so I would go to the hirings in the Faculty of Humanities. So it's not my area necessarily, but it's something which is related, so I can understand. So it's not completely alien, but I'm not there because I'm an expert on the field, but because I'm there to just make sure that from this side the process is transparent and I give advice, each of us gives advice, kind of making sure that it's a clear, transparent process. So I think this is how I would see our work. And beyond that, of course, we do organize events. We try to sensitize issues. There are new initiatives. So now we're trying to create a mechanism. So if individuals feel sexually harassed whatever type of harassment they're facing, that there are ways of contacting, phone numbers or contact places, so we're pushing for that at the moment at the university, so that there's like a kind of a safe line to call. Again, these are the kind of constantly trying to figure out new ways of making sure that everybody feels safe and comfortable and not discriminated or threatened in the university. And it's never ending. So as long as they're human beings, there's always and it's often, I think, the cases of the open sexism, the open discrimination occur, but they are not the main problem. They are a serious problem for those who are affected, but I think it's more the invisible routines and biases which just happen and which are not meant to be discriminatory. And so you have to be also very sensitive. I mean, we're trying to also be careful how we talk about it, because it's like not, it's not about, sometimes you have to confront really very bad, problematic behavior, but very often it's just about getting people to think about it more critically. And then it doesn't help to say, oh, you're bad. You just have to kind of just explain why this might lead to bad results, and not, cannot kind of go on confrontation, but kind of convince people in decision-making places that this is maybe not the best approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we mentioned now, 3 centers or 1 office and 2 centers. Do you work together, and in what way do you cooperate?
I mean, we work together in the sense that we exchange information. Of course, we have very different, it's interlocking, so there is certainly communication, and when we're kind of new initiatives which are relevant, we would talk to each other. I mean, there are other offices, so we have also an office for conflict resolution in the university, which deals with, kind of conflicts, kind of more kind of mediation between individuals who might be conflicting. So it's less about discrimination, but mediation. So also with them we work together. So it's all these bodies which try to really make the university more, a welcoming, livable space. So, I mean, it's not that there's I would say it's a mutual awareness and working together where necessary, but it's not institutionalized as such. But it's more that we inform each other and we're kind of know of each other, and we're thinking of each other when it's necessary and when it makes sense.
Now let's turn to the audience. Are there any questions that you would like to ask Professor Bieber?
If I may.
Please,
Thank you very much, Florian, for this thorough presentation, impressive work that you have done. I must say that perhaps, unfortunately, you're not at the right place, because Faculty of Arts is really a faculty where awareness of the issue is high, whereas in other faculties, perhaps we face a major obstacle, which is, in your case, probably was the phase 1, that is awareness raising, that there is such an issue that needs to be tackled. And perhaps I would just add to what you have presented to us. At the University of Ljubljana, last year we adopted the Gender Equality Plan, obligatory. Then we adopted this year Action Plan, and we formed Action Group, which will surveil the implementation of Action Plan. My colleague Jasna is sitting behind me, and she will probably agree with me that the major problem is really to find people who would act in those capacities. And often people would just say, I don't see myself in this role, this is not something that is of my concern. So we are quite hopeful actually that the new massive turn that is occurring at the level of the EU and also globally toward qualitative habilitation will provide a tool for us where we will really assess the social work, so contribution to society, to well-being, as an element of assessment in your habilitation process. So this is one way to motivate people really to do something behind their own research work. So there is this tool. It seems to me that it's very important that we also, inform people, especially young academic staff, that there are different paths in academia if you have children or if you do not have children, and that concerns both men and women. So it's a different story, it's a different game. And it seems to me that services that you provide can really sort of contribute to awareness raising. My question is, in Slovenia, whenever we want to implement or introduce new forms of social organization at the level of university, we face enormous legal obstacles. How did you deal? Because you don't want to have kindergarten at the level of IKEA, game playground. You want to probably have quality care for children. So what are the national obstacles, legislative, or is it discovered by your cooperation with the city of Graz, which is actually a very good idea. Just something to think. In our case, because we have cooperation with city of Ljubljana, maybe that is a kind of bypass, a way to bypass national legislation. So that would be my first question. Second question, you said that you have people who participate in these committees. How do you recruit them? How do you get them interested in this kind of work? Interdisciplinary, because I assume that in humanities, social sciences, there's more sort of awareness and willingness to participate. That's the case at University of Ljubljana, whereas natural sciences, technical sciences, it's harder to get people to understand that this is something that we need to deal with.
Thanks. I mean, I think on the first question, I mean, I think the University of Graz does not run a kindergarten, it doesn't run a school, so all of that is cooperative. So, you know, so for example, we have this, you know, there's a daycare center which offers places for children from the age of 1 upwards, and then there's a kindergarten, both of which are affiliated with the university, but they are run by a company on behalf of the city of Graz, so they run by the same conditions as all the other kindergartens. And it's just that children whose parents are either students or faculty are privileged in the acceptance process, and they happen to be next to the university physically. So that's the way it works. It doesn't mean that you are guaranteed a place. So for example, my son didn't get a place in the kindergarten. He had to go to a different kindergarten. Because again, there are more children who need places than there are spots in the kindergarten. And you know, they don't privilege professors over students, children, which is great. I mean, but in that sense, it's just an agreement, but it means it makes it easier as an access point that's physically next to the university. So also it's easier to combine that, and that's just an agreement which was made at some point. The other option which I've mentioned is, again, this is a private association. It's an NGO basically, which runs this daycare center, which is again physically in the university, close to the campus, which offers these hour-by-hour care, which is you can pay for, but it's subsidized. And there's also subsidies, for example, of the student association has subsidies or has special conditions for students who have children, for example. So they use some of the budget they have to subsidize.
Okay, so that's a crucial question. Sorry to interrupt. So it's outsourced.
Yeah.
And who's subsidizing it?
No, so that case, for example, like, I mean, so we have a very strong student association in Austria. So if you're a student in Austria, you pay, you don't pay tuition in universities, but the one thing you pay is a semester, 50 euros per semester for the student union. And the student union uses the money for multiple purposes. So one of the purposes is, for example, to provide some subsidies for students who have children, for example, for taking them to this daycare center, which offers these hourly cares, which of course is really only relevant if you don't have yet a place in a regular daycare, because then of course, I mean, the regular daycare offers that for free or for very low cost. It's in Graz, daycare and kindergarten is paid, but it's based on income. So if you have lower income, if you're a student, it's for free, and then if you're a professor, you pay more, but even that is not very expensive. So in that sense, I think the university, of course, is careful not to, go into areas which, I mean, would be legally and logistically very complicated. So it's more about cooperation rather than that. And again, when it comes to these things, like like the room there, which I mentioned, I mean, it's a room, it's a space. It requires. This is why it's not like IKEA in the sense that there is no, so you have to be there with an adult supervision. So we don't have a caretaker there. But again, it's about things which are, it's kind of using the space which is available and creating it without conflicting with legal issues. Now, the second question you asked, how do you create motivation? I mean, again, for all of us, I mean, I have we all of us have plenty of work, and it's an additional piece of work in our lives. I mean, it's no doubt. If I'm part of an appointment committee for a professor as a member of the Equal Opportunities body, it means usually 4 committee sessions, which one of them takes at least 4 hours. The other one is a hearing of the candidates, which takes 2 days. So all of a sudden, I have a commitment of several work days just with this one process. So how do you get people to do this voluntarily? I mean, first of all, you ask. It's based on personal. You ask people to join. I mean, I was asked by colleagues who said, do you want to join? I mean, and I volunteered, and I think it's people get asked to join, and I think it helps if they're from the faculty. So you find people in the faculties who are more receptive to that, and you ask them to join, because they are then the ones who are also going to build credibility and again in the faculty. And then at one point they might want to leave, but they will then communicate it to their peers in a way which you might not be able to. So if you are, coming from the humanities faculty, you probably cannot talk to somebody from the natural sciences in the same way as somebody who's a professor in the natural sciences to their peers of why this is worth doing. And of course, it's a gradual process. I mean, it's because there is no reward, right? I mean, in the direct physical sense, right? I mean, one of the elements also which somebody was kind of convincing to me, said this always made sense to me, and I see this is often that my female colleagues often get overburdened with committee works, as you all probably know.
Sounds familiar.
Because there has to be a woman on it, or there has to be a gender balance, but it ends up actually leading to actually
imbalance.
Women having more non-academic work at universities than their male colleagues, because you want to achieve gender equality. So it's kind of absurdity that trying to achieve equality leads to the actual discrimination, because if you're sitting in a committee, you're not doing research and you're not doing the main academic work you would like to do at a university. So this is one of the arguments which convinced me to join, because I said, one way to undo this balance is to join as a man, because then I take I try to do the job seriously, but I also then it means it doesn't have to be a woman doing it who then has to take it away from her research time, and it creates a bit more balance. So in a certain way, you convince people by these arguments, by saying, listen, this is you change the environment by doing this, and you learn something in the process. So, but you have to build allies, but I fully agree with you. It's not easy, and again, the body has been around now for 30 years, and in the beginning, I think again I've been at the University of Graz only for 13 years, so not most of the history of that. But at the beginning, I know from colleagues who have been there, they said there were lots of resistance. It was very hard to convince male colleagues to even participate, because they thought it's not my problem. I mean, I'm happy to help you, but it's not my problem. But it's changing. I mean, it's changing over time. And of course, if you go to a meeting and a third of the members are men, then it's not weird anymore. It's not so it's kind of like mutually reinforcing. If you see nobody laughs at me for being there in Graz. It's not seen as a strange thing, and so of course then I don't have a problem with being there. So it's like it's a chicken and an egg kind of discussion, but in a certain way, But I think it's if you build allies and you have allies in these bodies who are also members of the community, we're not seen as outsiders. It makes it a lot easier to kind of build acceptance, and I think that's the way forward. I would say in a nutshell.
Thank you. I have to excuse myself for being Dutch. Thank you.
Any other questions, perhaps? Yes. Professor Bieber.
You mentioned that in this talks and evaluation process for the new applicants, one of the members will go to sick. Can you remember any situation in which you or your colleagues has to warn the Commission that there is a sexist remark or there is something wrong, and how they react to it. Because it's really important if you are only sitting there, or you can change something in the process if you are there.
I'm sure this has occurred, of course, no doubt. I haven't encountered it in the committee meetings I've been to, like this kind of. Usually, I think we all would be advised to intervene. To say something. Again, we would choose what would be the right format, and would it be immediately or would it be, depending on the impact of the situation. I do think that the culture in institutions has changed, that this wouldn't happen in a public in a meeting where I would be present. What people then say once the meeting is over, or when they talk in a smaller group or so, is very hard to reconstruct. But I think people are quite careful, and maybe it's also, of course, because they are also aware that we're sitting there. This is part of the whole. One of the purposes of sitting there is that people who might be tempted by that might think twice, because they are aware that somebody is sitting there who are, sensitive about these issues and will probably say something. So I think that, I've been now in the committee for 3 years, and we meet twice a semester and we exchange our experiences. We report to each other about the processes. If there's anything remarkable, if there's something, of course, urgent, important, we alert the office, and then we discuss how to handle it. What are the legal means? What are the informal means of dealing with it? These are, of course, but if there are serious reservations, we can list also objections, and we can, we can challenge the process. The whole, we don't have a voting right, but we have a right to, make complaints, especially if there are, discrimination, if there are any legal grounds which merit that. So we can intervene if there is a basis for it. But as far as, in the time I've been there, there's been none of these processes where anybody has mentioned that this is the issue. The other issues, for example, how do you deal with that is what is called in German Befangenheit, which means that you are biased in the process. Because, for example, in Austria, according to the law, you cannot be deciding on a hire if you are in a personal relationship with a person, or if you are a collaborator with a person, hierarchical, for example. If you're hiring a professor and you are his or her boss, or something like that. And these are issues which are quite sensitive. Sometimes not when it's clear. The problem is if the relationship is, for example, not a marriage, but if it's not a declared relationship, but you find out about it, and then how do you handle that? And so this is then gets to be quite tricky. So it's more these. I think most of the issues we have been facing are the more subtle ones, rather than that somebody would make a sexist remark at a meeting, which at that kind of a meeting. But I think it is a result of us being there, just being there makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I will read the question because we made it. Yeah. What about students which are primarily caretakers of their either elderly or sick family members? Is there any help or options? Because that usually takes a lot of time during your studies. Do you have any good practices or solutions in your university or maybe at your faculty?
I think this is again where the UniCare comes in. So again, we don't have care facilities, but what they do provide consultancy and advice and help to find arrangements. So this is something which is, I think, changed in recent years to be much more awareness of that. So this is one of the elements where UniCare is not just about dealing with children, but also with parents or grandparents or elderly dependents you might have to take care of as a student, and so this is where they provide them guidance of how to do it. We also have, especially a new interdisciplinary research center on aging studies. So there's a great also interest in our university in this point of view from an academic point of view, but it's also from a very critical perspective. So there's a lot of also then academic research, with aging questions, as well as there, like, for example, living labs with elderly. So there's all kinds of academic points. So, for example, if the Unicare would like to get advice also on how to deal with these issues, because they are very engaged academics. It's not just kind of research on, but with communities who are affected. So there's that element. But it's mostly in the terms of advising. So the Unicare would be the place where a student would go and say, how can I combine my studies with, taking care of my sick or, frail father and mother or so on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Adamra.
I'm also interested in how to raise awareness, because, for example, if some lecture is organized, then it's usually attended by those who are already aware of these issues and not by those who should be there. So, I know it's a process, it takes a lot of time, but, for example, I always get the idea that that these things don't get to the people that should be listening to them.
I agree. Well, I think there's one element which, I'm not saying that everything is perfect, but the idea to have a training program for academic staff members who are joining the faculty, especially, it's lacking at the level of professors, right? So because professors are assumed to be perfect, right? So, just kidding. No, because they're assumed not to require additional training. But anybody who's beginning as an academic researcher has this training program. This is certainly dealt with. As far as I know from my own colleagues who work in the center I'm the director of, they've told me that they're not always happy with it. But there's at least this is part of the training is about these issues. I think it's not yet perfect, and there's still much room to be improved, but at least you can say that young researchers are trained about this. I do think there's a problem that professors, when you join as a professor, so you're not, you come as an outsider you are not required to any of that. So, this is offered as an additional, the additional workshops, training, and of course, if you are, it's still very helpful. Some of the ones I've been part of, or workshops or events have helped me a lot, because even though I was open in the sense that I was willing, as I mentioned, it's like daycare conferences. There are many things which, even if you have good intentions, or if you're overall trying to be aware, you don't know, or you never thought about. So I think it really makes a big difference, even if you are already open. It doesn't mean that you're thinking of all of the things, because how could you? You can't think of. You're thinking of a lot of things. So if somebody gives you these suggestions, that can be very helpful. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic about it. But it's true, of course, that if you are in the people who are in decision-making positions don't get the training or don't get the advice if they don't want to listen to it. We cannot. What we can do, of course, is to say we are always there in the processes. So they get evaluated. Their centers get, not people, but if you're running a successful research center, you get evaluated. You still have to also get evaluated by us, and we can say if there's a problem. And if there are researchers who feel discriminated, disadvantaged, they can turn to us. So that's the way to do it. But I think there's a larger problem. And I don't know. I don't know the Slovenian system well enough, but Austrian academia traditionally has been very hierarchical, has been very centered on professors, with a lot of precarity at the level of non-professorial researchers, with limited contracts and great vulnerability. And that's a structural problem. And this leads to all kinds of disadvantages, which are not open discrimination often, but of course can also lead to that, because the dependencies are great. And this is something I was before that in the English system, which is very different, which is a much flatter hierarchy. It's changed in the last years, and I felt that was a lot better, because there are less opportunities for abusing the precarity of researchers. And I think this is, if I would say, the biggest problem I see in the system in Austria is that basically everybody who is not a professor as a researcher has a precarious work contract, and as a result is vulnerable, and as a result opens opportunities for discrimination and disadvantagement. Even if you're trying to be fair and correct, it puts them, they're still in a vulnerable position, and this is the biggest problem, I would say, structurally. And that to change that is really very, very difficult, because, Austria passed a law, changed the university law a few years ago, which meant that if you are if you don't have a permanent job contract, you can only have it at one university for up to 7 years. And after 7 years, you cannot be extended. So the idea was to actually create less dependency, but the end result is to create more dependency, because basically after 7 years you're out. So if you're a researcher, I know researchers who are excellent, great researchers, and they've been researching for 5 years, they're saying I have 2 more years, I have a family, I'm not going to pack my bags and move to Vienna, to Innsbruck, Salzburg, or somewhere else with my family just like that. So I'm going to leave academia. And this is the real problem we're facing in terms of Austria, but also many other academic systems.
Any other questions? If not, before ending, I would like to ask you to shed some light on the recent developments in Serbia, because you are the expert in Southeastern studies. We have witnessed mass shootings in Belgrade at an elite primary school and also in Mladenovac. So could you give us your view of why this happened? After 10 years, I think, that there has been no mass shootings in Serbia. And some believe that the high gun ownership may be the reason for that. Others, that those mass shootings came with hostile or hate speech and promotional violence in the media. What would be your opinion on that? Because this is also growing important issues nowadays in Slovenia.
Thanks. Now that we're talking about my research topic, you asked me a very difficult question. I've been discussing this with friends and colleagues in Serbia since the shootings have occurred. And first of all, I would say one has to be very careful not to jump to conclusions. And we've had some people, including ministers in Serbia, who said it was Western culture and video games which are responsible. Which is equally silly as some people who said it's Serbian war crimes in the 90s which are responsible, which is also not very helpful and it doesn't understand the complexity. I think I think in many societies, this can happen in most societies. We're lucky in Europe, including Serbia, that this is not happening in the frequency that's happening in the United States, for example. And it's very clear that gun ownership is part of the story. If we look at why it happens in America so frequently. And in that sense, you could say it seems to be even lucky that Serbia has not had more incidences, considering how many people own guns in Serbia. The statistics always indicate that Serbia is one of the top countries in the world with gun ownership. And many of them illegally, many of them acquired during the 1990s. But I think gun ownership in its own right doesn't explain why it happens, because also why hasn't it happened more often in Serbia than in the last years. So I think probably any explanation will have to take multiple facets into account. But I think one of the elements is certainly a society where the glorification of violence has become quite important. It's just a few meters from the school where there's the big mural for Ratko Mladic and for Draža Mihailovic and for Putin. And they're all within 200-300 meters from the school. Now, I don't want to link the school to the murals, but I'm just saying that this is, if you go through Belgrade, you have dozens of murals celebrating war criminals. And they weren't there 10 or 15 years ago. I lived in Belgrade from 2001 to 2006, and there were no murals for war criminals like Ratko Mladic or alike at that time. So these are new, and these are part of the government's policies. They're painted by hooligans, by whatever, but you can't erase them. I know people who live in some of those buildings, and they say we can't paint over them because the guys protect them. Now, if you have a rule of law state, you can do something about that. But clearly the state does not want to do something about that. And this is just part of it. If you watch reality TV shows in Serbia like Fatima and other ones where you have well-known criminals being invited because they're criminals, where you have war criminals commenting on the war in Ukraine. You know, you have people who were sentenced by the ICTY for war crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who were released after they've served their sentence, and who are now commentators on breakfast television, on Serbian TV, to comment about Russian aggression against Ukraine, and who compare the war in Ukraine with their own war in the 1990s, and who kind of mentally map themselves onto Russia. So, you know, these people, or, you know, Vojislav Šešelj, who also was sentenced and who has been endorsing, supporting war crimes, is a regular guest on talk shows. Nearly every week he can be found in one of the talk shows, and he openly celebrates violence. And so, if you read Serbian tabloids, which are the most popular newspapers in the country, there's a constant celebration of violence. I mean, the biggest, you know, tabloid interviewed a rapist. So all of that, I think, again, it's never a linear process, and that, you know, one has to look at the individual who committed this act or those acts and judge it. But I think there's a larger issue of violence in a society where basically the government and the public, you know, the public gives it legitimacy that the use of force is acceptable in certain circumstances for certain goals, and cultivates and glorifies violence. And I mean, at least I think it creates space for this to happen. Whether it would have happened or not happened without that is impossible to tell. But it certainly makes it more acceptable, or makes it in a certain way, might be encouraging for those who might be vulnerable or might be otherwise not encouraged to do that.
Thank you.
So what should be done to change this situation? What do you suggest?
Well, to some degree, you know, I think it's part of the government's, you know, a government which is, you know, because you could say it's media, but the media are controlled by the government. It's not a democratic environment. So if you have an authoritarian environment, which is also deeply linked with organized crime and hooligan groups, which is well documented, then it's very hard to change that. I mean, I think it can change, of course. You know, we had protests in Belgrade the other day where citizens went to the streets. So certainly civic groups can make a difference, but it's very hard to fight against a state which you know, sees the response to have more police, and which doesn't want to change the media reporting, which it controls. So it's not about censorship, but it's about, you know, controlling the media, which are already controlled by the government directly or indirectly. So in a certain way, I think it's very hard for a society to change that. But I think, you know, as somebody who's lived in Serbia, you know, and also have friends who have children. I mean, I often hear stories of, you know, the massive level of bullying that children are encountering, the kind of everyday violence children are encountering. And I have myself, you know, asked myself, would I want to live in having lived in Serbia, would I want my son to grow up in that environment? I would say no, because I see that, you know, in order to survive in schools, often you have to be aggressive to confront it. You can't be, you know, seen as being quote unquote soft and all of that. And these are not values I would like to have my children take away from that. So I think it's a real challenge for parents who want their children not to be exposed to that. And I know from my friends, you know, friends who are in that environment who are struggling with it and who don't get the support from the state and who don't get this. And some teachers are, of course, aware of it, but not all teachers are, and they're also under pressure. So it's a structural issue, and I think it's very hard to change from the bottom up if the state is kind of blocking it, and if, you know, so it requires a broader process of I think introspection. You know, and I mean, I don't think that the lack of dealing with the crimes of the 90s is responsible for the mass shooting. But I do think that it creates a society which is deeply troubled with itself. If you have not talked critically about what's going on, if you can deny genocide in Srebrenica, if you can deny war crimes every day, if you think about how NATO intervention in 1999 was commemorated in Serbia, it's as if there were no Albanians in Kosovo hurt, as if there were no Albanians expelled from Kosovo. It's not talked about, and I think that creates a society which has a fundamental black spot, undealt with area in its recent history, and I think that creates an environment which is nurturing for criminals, for nationalists, for people who are, again, who celebrate the use of armed force as a way to resolve problems. And, I don't think it's a linear, it's not a direct line from that to mass shootings, but I think there is a connection in a society which does not say, violence as a way, the way. You can have a very complex view of what happened in the 90s, and I don't want to say it simplistically, but certainly the way which is talked about it in Serbia is very problematic. And I think this is really, this is part of a larger problem of not being able to confront demons. I mean, every society has its demons, right? And if you can't confront them without risking, being accused of being a traitor, I mean, it's the public discourse as well. If you are political opposition, you're called a traitor, right? I mean, I've been critical of the government. I've been called a shitkovski lobista. I've been called all kinds of things by the media in Serbia. These kind of terminologies alone tell you something about a social environment where it's possible to accuse an academic who disagrees with you of being a paid platonik, paid for by foreign forces, an agent, and all of that. This is, this has consequences for a society, and I think this is part of the problem, that these are not dealt with, and it's what worries me is that the longer time passes, it gets sometimes harder to deal with those things, because they become reproduced through the educational system. I think surveys show that younger children who actually don't remember the 90s have more nationalist views than the people who actually experienced the 1990s, because the educational system reproduces it and tells them that they don't remember the complexity and the nuances and so on, so they get a simplistic national story, and challenging that gets harder. So I find, I've been teaching many years also in Belgrade at the political science faculty, because we have a joint master's program, and I find that students have more nationalist view when it comes to Kosovo than 10, 15 years ago, when actually you could say back then it was much rawer, the memory, and I don't want to deny the fact that people that being bombed by NATO was certainly not a traumatic experience, but it's now people who are more nationalists who don't remember that at all, who were born afterwards. And so this is, I think, the problem of how then these mindsets gets reproduced and reinforced, in fact, and this is really what worries me for the society.
Any other questions? If not, I would like to thank you for participating at this panel discussion. I'm very grateful for all your insights and views and all the valuable information that you shared with us. This will be very valuable to both the Faculty of Arts and the University of Ljubljana to implement the initiatives addressing family-work balance, but also gender equality initiatives in general. Thank you.